the country of future growth and used to be for decades. And whenever I went there in the past, it not fully materialized.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Alexandria Center for Life Sciences at Stanford Research Park. This is the third event in a series examining how technology can contribute to a sustainable future. And we've brought together groups previously in Munich and Singapore, and we're delighted to be here in Silicon Valley this evening with a live audience, as well as those of you participating online. So the focus of this evening's conversation is energy, how we generate and distribute it, how we make sure that transition is equitable, and how technology becomes a key enabler in this transition. Thank you all for joining us. Delighted to have you with us, and we're extremely keen that as many of you as possible participate. If you're online, please do submit questions using the platform that you're engaging with us on, and we'll be bringing our live audience into the conversation later on after we've heard from our panel. So I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed speakers this evening. Starting at that end, Andreas, who you've met earlier on. Andreas Urschitz is a member of the Management Board and Chief Marketing Officer of Infineon Technologies. Katie Mennert is the CEO and founder of Ally Energy, a community built around the jobs and skills needed for the green transition. Eric Stokes is Deputy Director of the Energy Research and Development Division of the California Energy Commission. Elizabeth Kaiga is Chief Commercial Officer of DNV North America, where she provides strategies and solutions to support the transition to sustainable energy. Please welcome our panel. So, Andreas, we're going to start with you. Obviously, tackling climate heating is humanity's greatest challenge and a hugely complex undertaking, as I think everyone understands. And because of its complexity, many organizations and individuals, they kind of feel overwhelmed. They don't really know where to start. How do you think about it in practical ways where we can make progress? How can we have real impact? How can we create momentum?
Recently my daughter was asking me the similar question, I decided to use a CO2 calculator and look into my own carbon footprint. And the outcome was pretty much interesting, and I believe to some degree it could be then also representative for one of the other of the ladies and gentlemen participating here. And there's a story. The biggest portion of my CO2 footprint stems from the way I enjoy mobility. So it is, so to say, commuting by car, but then also this traveling back and forth using airplanes. That's a big chunk of CO2 emission. Second point is the way I'm living, and the way I'm living is actually how I'm heating and cooling my house, but also living and working within the office space. And the third point is the way how I'm eating. And a significant portion of my CO2 footprint also stems from the consumption of meat, if you will, coming from the agricultural sector, emitting a lot of methane. And having said that, this gives already three very practical areas where everybody of us can get started.
Yeah.
So because we have a choice in the way we are using mobility, using an electronic car or using a combustion engine, flying for every occasion, or maybe using whatever kind of different communication alternatives. We have a choice to use renewable energy, for instance, for cooling and heating the house instead of fossil-based. And we have a choice to go a little bit more vegetarian instead of meat every day.
All right, so very practical suggestions you're coming up with here. I want to come to the rest of you guys now. There's a lot of, very challenging headlines we're seeing at the moment. Today, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said that global warming has ended, and now we're in the era of global boiling. We're seeing record temperatures. We've seen it in India. We're seeing it in Europe at the moment. We've seen, Canadian wildfires here in North America. We're seeing a lot of alarming data points. So I'd love to get a sense from you guys about success stories. So maybe, Katie, we can start with you. Can you give the audience a kind of like a very clear example maybe of an initiative that you've participated in or you've been involved with that can act maybe as an exemplar for how we can make progress on some of these challenges?
So the exciting thing about what's happening right now is that the will behind the people is there. We want to change. And I think the really neat thing I'm seeing in Texas, where I live, and in Houston, the energy capital of the world, is that the current fossil-based system, the leadership, and the workforce want to move and want to change. And I think that's a good example. We have a workforce that is ready, and we have capital, and we also have projects that are underway. So I think it's important, when we look back at how energy has evolved, we've been in energy transitions for a while. I think the spirit and the ingenuity of Americans and the people on the ground in Texas and across the U.S., that's what's going to help move this forward. So I'm personally excited about the workforce piece. We can talk about the bad side of that later, but I personally believe that it's important to have that people commitment, not just the tech and the capital.
All right, so you feel that there really is a mindset shift that's gone on. Eric, a positive example maybe you could share with us as well, please.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't know is one of the roles of government in the public sector is to push out new technology innovations into the marketplace and take these technologies to the stage that the private sector is willing to invest and adopt. About a decade ago, the venture capital industry basically saw clean tech as a really bad investment.
Right.
In around 2013, essentially dropped out. I think total investment in the US around that time was about $2 billion. And myself, several others working in the federal government, working across state governments, we really went back and looked, what were the challenges, what were the problems, and what could we do from a policy and a program standpoint to really try to bring the private sector back into investing in new technology innovation. So one of the things we did in California is we really created a network of incubator and accelerator programs across the state to really guide these startups and really try to make sure they avoid a lot of the pitfalls that they encounter on their journey. We also stage-gated a number of funding programs that we were validating these technologies at different stages, and through that we were providing the information, we were providing a lot of the validation that the private sector needed to say this is a good investment. And I think the most recent numbers I saw, across the nation, we were about 64 billion in private investment in 2021. We still have a long ways to go. We're still going to need a lot more investment coming into these technologies, but it's a long way from where we were at a decade ago.
Okay, so individual shifts, mindset change, government really now, with a clear kind of like agenda towards change. Elizabeth, anything else you're seeing?
I'm going to combine all of the above. So on a personal level, I sit on 2 boards that support women in clean energy and sustainability. So part of that is the professional development of women. But the other piece to that is bringing clean energy solutions in parts of the world that are off-grid. So one of those organizations is Solar Sister. And the initiative that I'm proud of is getting into a 3rd country recently, where we can deploy those solutions in a very simple form in places where they're needed. And then borrowing on the larger scale, and this might sound like a DNV commercial, but it's not. But borrowing from Eric's, it's also the fact that as my day job, we focus on doing very practical technical due diligence on a lot of the existing and emerging technologies, making sure that those technologies are bankable, that they're safe, that they perform, and in doing that, obviously securing the financing that Eric just mentioned. So those 2 things combined, I think, would be my highlights.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, Elizabeth, I'm going to stick with you if that's possible.
Yes.
We're talking about like a wholesale transformation of the economy. We're talking about really sort of significant changes that are going to have to go on, while also maintaining lifestyles of people in high-income countries like the United States. How can we continue to do that while also bringing everyone with us, while continuing to lift people out of poverty and drive equality?
I think it's got to be a multi-prong approach. So the key to the question that you just asked is wholesale transformation. And I don't think that we can do more of the same.
Okay.
So clearly something has got to change, because doing more of the same doesn't really get us where we need to get. We're not just talking about mitigating climate change, but also reversing some of the things that have come before us. So I think in order for that to happen, I would say we need to look at this in a more holistic way.
Yeah.
Look at technologies that help with removing those emissions, look at technologies that help with mitigating some of that, but also look at simple things like energy efficiency, which I think is underrated, but really, really important. I'll get into a little bit more of a discussion relative to the US market around policy, around financing, and some of the challenges that are unique to this market. But I think looking at the whole, the analogy that somebody used was a laundry basket, but looking at it with all the pieces in it and dealing with those piece by piece is how we get through the pile of very dirty laundry that we have to sort.
Okay, lots of laundry to do. Eric, you've got a big pile of laundry to take care of it from a kind of perspective of government. So, both the private sector and government talk a lot about innovation. It's kind of one of those words that we kind of throw around, and it kind of means different things to different people. How do you think about innovation? And also, within that context, how can the public and the private sectors best work together?
Yeah, I tend to think about it on two sides. I think about the technology innovation, which is where I spend a lot of my day-to-day, but there's also kind of the policy and regulatory innovation,
right,
in developing new types of policies and regulatory frameworks that can create a lot of the market pull or the market demand for a lot of these new technologies. And when we go through this process, we want to have a lot of engagement from the private sector. We want to understand what's reasonable, what's feasible, what's realistic as we design these various policies and regulatory programs and frameworks, so that we're not setting a standard or we're not setting a policy that's not attainable,
right,
or that's going to have a lot of unintended consequences.
Right, so it has to be attainable, it has to be achievable, people have to be able to act on it. Katie, I think that clearly, you mentioned earlier that you were really thinking about there's that kind of like mindset shift in a lot of organizations. In your work at Ally, you're obviously building a community around this kind of this workforce of the future, this talent that we're going to need. Give us a sense of what trends you're seeing and what these kind of, and how that's taking shape in organizations.
So I wish I had a lot of great news to report in this area, but I think the folks that are in the audience and online know that we are in a talent shortage. We are not going to AI our way out of this, is what I like to say. The skills we need for these new jobs, we've not prepared that workforce. We also have a proportionate amount of workers in different places that may not necessarily be in new installations for renewable energy. There's a lot of studies going on right now looking at how do we move workforce across the US. What does that look like? What are those skills? The other thing I'd like to tell you is, and you probably all know this as well, is everybody's got a phone. That's where our kids learn today. Okay. Parents aren't necessarily talking about energy and climate change at home. We need to do more of that. But we're not doing it in the schools. School systems are broke. They're broken and broke. So we've really got to think about this. It's a multi-generational challenge that VC money sometimes look at and says, well, but I want it solved by, in 3 to 4, So capital and technology are a piece to this, but we really have to think about how do we shift the workforce. And is immigration obviously a part of that? What do we need to do to get this next generation? And it shouldn't be, we were talking about this earlier, robbing Peter to pay Paul, lots of, we're going to steal talent and things like that. That's not a strategy. We need to get more people into the sector, and we need to recognize what skills we need, and we need to start training for those skills. So I wish I had good news. The news is we don't have enough people. But the opportunity is that we do have jobs ahead, and that's a great way to get people engaged in the energy transition.
All right, well, let's talk good news as well. You talked about VC capital flowing in, and obviously corporate VCs flowing in as well. Andreas, in terms of where that capital should go, in terms of the technologies that you feel could really change things, where do you think we should be deploying that capital in terms of the technologies that are going to really help us solve some of these challenges that we face?
There's quite a bunch of technologies, such as mentioned previously in the introduction. The electrification of everything typically helps to get out of fuels or whatever kind of that sort of energy carriers towards things that surround us using electricity. But this, of course, only makes sense when in parallel we manage to generate our energy, so to generate electricity, not out of coal. So it has to be generated out of renewable energy, if you will, so that the overall equation makes sense. So this is 2 simple examples. And coming back to what we discussed before, talking about policy making, I was always so much impressed by the way of California, very early starting with energy efficiency legislation from a European perspective. I just learned before that it's the state's target to be carbon neutral by 2045. I'm scratching my head whether getting us there. Do you have enough talent, Eric, from your perspective? Do you have enough technology, or is there a lack of money, or a little bit of everything?
It's a little bit of everything. I think, so one of California's goals is to be carbon neutral by 2045. It's an enormous build out, the number of resources and assets in terms of renewable generation and storage that we're going to need to deploy in the next several years to be able to meet some of these targets. And we're going to run into some barriers. We're going to run into interconnection barriers. We already are. We're going to run into permitting barriers, and we are also going to run into workforce barriers. We just don't have the workforce. We've invested in a lot of battery technology companies in California. They can't find the workers they need. They tend to poach from a lot of each other. There's comfort in that because they know they can find talent, but it's not a long-term solution. And most of these companies are beginning to scale up their manufacturing, and so they're going to need skilled workers that are to manufacture their products, be able to work plants, and they just don't exist. And they don't just exist in California. They can't find them in other parts of the nation as well.
Katie, maybe you should. Sorry, Andreas. Carry on.
Yeah,
but from your perspective, is it then right in saying yes, technology is a solution to stop global warming, but it's also a problem because listening to what you said, Katie, many people influx towards then when they graduate, rather towards software, smartphone or whatever kind of technologies, instead of being interested in working in the energy sector. Is this so?
No, it is, and I think the other compounding factor is we do have to look at history. So in the 80s, the oil industry went through a massive bust and stopped hiring and investing in talent and science and all of those things. And you may say, well, why does that matter? It matters. Because a lot of talent shifted to, I want to go work in technology, or I want to go work in finance, or I want to go work in banking. Layer on that we just went through this massive crew change. I think COVID was the tail end of that. It started several years back. And then we had COVID, okay? And now we have a generation that cares about impact, but they don't want to work for energy companies. And they don't want to work for green energy companies. They want to work in banking, and they want to work in tech. So I say, hey, we got to do something about energizing everybody to be a part of this, right? Make this about jobs and economic prosperity as we start this transition. But it's got to be a marathon mindset. We've got some of the most talented people in the oil and gas industry that have moved into geothermal. I sit with entrepreneurs at Greentown Labs. We went from 0 to 75 startups in 2 years, and the goal was 50 startups in 5 years in Houston. So there's talent there to harness, but we gotta start looking earlier. Most kids, my kid's 12, that's the best age to talk to a kid about getting excited about science or math or technology or all the other opportunities that are out there. But right now they got their heads in the phones and they want to work for tech. So it's a bit of a trilemma.
Yeah. And just building what you said, I mean, we've had our manufacturing overseas for so long.
Yes.
And now there's a focus on onshoring so much of our manufacturing for the
Building.
clean energy sector. It's going to take time. It's not something you just do overnight. And so it's going to take time. It's going to take investment. Because we've lost a lot of that expertise in the United States.
Okay, so it'd be great to take now a question, I think, coming in from some of the participants who are watching online. And you guys are talking about some of the challenges. Another one of the challenges is in that high-income countries, we still have very high levels of inequality. And one of the questions that's coming in from one of the participants joining us online is about the social cost of implementing renewable energy technology. Elizabeth, maybe you could comment on that from your perspective.
Yeah, I think we've seen the social cost of not implementing renewable energy technology as well. So I think you can look at that two ways, right?
Yeah.
So the social cost of not implementing it is what we've seen with the impact of climate change. That tends to, looking at the US landscape, that has been a bigger burden on the most vulnerable communities that get hit the hardest. When we have hurricanes, when we have this extreme weather situation. So I think there's a cost to it, obviously, in terms of funding, in terms of what are we giving up. I think COVID has been an interesting precedent to that, where we've all learned that sometimes you've got to give up individual freedoms in order to benefit the broader community. So yes, there might be some level of cost to implementing it, but I think the cost of not doing that is higher, and it's going to hit our most vulnerable communities the most. And so I think, I can't give you a number on what that cost is, but what I can say is it would be too risky at this point in time not to consider that option.
Sure.
So, I see the cost the other way around, which is if we don't do it, then we lose our resiliency. We hurt the people that are most vulnerable in our society. So, I would say that there is a vested interest in doing that,
Sure, 100%.
despite the social cost.
Yeah, no, and that was the conversation at the last COP, really
Yes.
was about who is going to pay for this transition, because we're seeing in countries like Bangladesh and elsewhere that are really, really suffering. So, Katie, I want to get back to what you were just saying. You talked about the incubator that you're part of. Like, I'm really intrigued, and Eric, maybe you could jump in on this as well, in terms of like understanding kind of like how important you think the startup ecosystem is going to be, and really sort of like ensuring that we get these innovations in order to support the transition. Is there enough capital? Do we have we've talked about talent, but is that capital going in the right places, I guess, is my initial question.
So when Hurricane Harvey happened in Houston 5-6 years ago, the city of Houston said, we've got to do something. And they came together and we brought Greentown Labs to Houston. And for entrepreneurs like myself and others had been working on things and coming to the Valley and trying to get money and trying to convince people, in Silicon Valley that energy is technology, technology is energy, and it was like, this isn't software, we don't want to talk to you. So we went back, sitting in a bedroom trying to build a business without support is hard, okay? Houston, Texas has got a lot of money. It's got a lot of family money, it's got a lot of capital from angels, and there's a lot of corporate venture capital. And for somebody that's been in the oil industry and seen it evolve, the capital is moving, and there's a lot of support for the entrepreneurs. These big companies cannot come up with these ideas. They got to find those ideas and help invest and scale those ideas. So I'm excited about it because it's a place and it's a home for me to be. So we work with the incumbents, we work with finance providers, and we work with the region. And that collaborative approach, I think, is really important, right, to the transition.
Yeah, and it's not just capital they need patient capital.
Yeah.
Most of these companies, these technologies, they're not software solutions. They take 5 to 7 years to get to commercialization. I think where we're seeing a gap, there's either really big investments, multi-billions, and then there's your kind of Series A, Series B venture capital investments. Kind of within there tends to be kind of a gap in funding that hasn't really been addressed. I think the other place capital needs to go is we need more capital going into the support infrastructure, into incubators, accelerators, and various test beds that can really reduce the cost of entrepreneurship and help them get to commercialization quicker and cheaper. Just building off her point, most large companies don't have internal R&D operations anymore. I think they found a better business model just to scour for startups and either make strategic acquisitions or strategic investments. So if we don't have that pipeline to startups, we're just not going to have a lot of these technologies get to commercialization.
Okay.
And I think the only other thing that I would add to that is we tend to look at capital in a very conventional way, which is, VCs, private equity, investment banks. But I think we also have to figure out how different money can work together, right? So private-public partnerships. How does the Department of Energy, for example, with the grants, collaborate with investment banks to kind of deploy some of the solutions? So I think also thinking about creative ways to deploy that capital is going to be important going forward.
Okay, Andreas, did you want to jump in as well?
I'm just wondering, coming back to the Texas example and Houston being one of the epicenters historically always around the oil industry, whether this capital that is available and capital always flowing like water, so seeking its harbor to end up. So is there truly enough of that capital going into decarbonization efforts, or is it just capital that goes again in more of the same?
It's never enough. That's going to be my answer no matter what, because at the end of the day, it's hot outside. I got off the plane and it was 50 degrees cooler here. So when they called me naturally and said, could you come to San Francisco? I said, sure, I'll be there tomorrow, right? But it was 100 degrees last week, I believe, here, right? So, but where I'm going with that is a lot of these companies are public and they have priorities dictated by their investors and they want dividends. It's complicated. when people want to talk about how bad the industry is, I say, go sit down and talk to these people. They care about clean air and water. They're working hard at that. It is so hard to move this machine. If you look at how much we use and how much the bigs are supplying, it's still a very small, right, part. So how do we supply today so we don't have a disruption and then we have issues, right, with the, people who cannot afford energy, right? We don't want to see that. How do we keep infrastructure in place so that we can keep gas prices down, right? Okay. And how can we move at the same time? It is a massive effort. It's a very massive effort. But no, I think we need more money to come in. Houston's open. I mean, when the Department of Energy comes and when Secretary comes, I'm constantly, showing around new opportunities, new plays. There's a lot of activity happening in Texas, and Texas is not Austin. I'll just say that.
All right,
So.
let's move on from Texas. I want to bring us closer to home, and we have a special guest this evening. If you've been enjoying the delicious wine this evening, we have Steve McIntyre from McIntyre Vineyards here this evening, and he's obviously at the kind of like the sharp end of what's going on, because you're working with the land, you're working with in agriculture. So it'd be great to get your perspective as someone from the local area in terms of what are the challenges you're facing now that are kind of climate related in terms of the winery.
Thank you, and thank you for having us here. I think the biggest challenge we're starting to see is the temperatures. Last year, we had a heat dome. It was 10 days of 100-degree plus in some very cool areas like Salinas and Monterey, in fact. And that had a real fundamental impact on wine quality, to the point where that vintage is just not going to live up to the quality standards that you would expect if you're buying an expensive bottle of wine. And it was a real eye-opener for the wine industry, because we get heat out there in Napa, Sonoma, Paso Robles, but it usually is 4 days, not 10 days. So agriculture represents a huge potential for sequestering carbon, especially in permanent crops like grapes and orchards. There's 1.6 million acres of almonds in California.
Yeah.
And we have embarked upon a project with the municipal waste facility to produce biochar in a pyrolysis machine, slow pyrolysis, which is a very low energy input continuous process, from a waste stream that would otherwise go into the landfill. So agriculture can keep, with this process, it can keep methane and other greenhouse gases from going up where they're causing harm. And I think, from a technology standpoint, what we'd like to see is to take this, we got to scale it up. It could really have some significant impacts. So maybe someday you'll all figure out a way to have everyone in their house will have a little pyrolysis machine. Instead of taking your trash out to the sidewalk for somebody to collect, you put it in your pyrolysis machine, everything but metal, and you can make biochar, and at the same time it gives off heat, so you got a pizza oven, basically. So I think that we're missing out. We need to be looking at removing carbon while we transition to renewable energy. Thank you.
And give us a sense of like how that's affected your business. You're going to have to trying to make capital investments in different kinds of areas fundamentally.
Yeah, we're making capital investments in trying to protect wine grapes from these heat events. So we're changing trellis systems. We're pulling out old vineyards and we're deploying capital into new trellis systems that can mitigate those impacts. And we're moving closer and closer to the beach, basically, because of course the Monterey Bay is such a tremendous energy sink, and that cold water is really beneficial. So. And we're deploying equipment that is much more energy efficient. Fendt, a company out of Germany, is producing tractors that 30% more fuel efficient, right. And we're using renewable energy when we can get it. That's another problem. They promised it would be cheaper than conventional diesel. It's not. It's about 8 cents a gallon more, and the supply is not steady. So we need to work on that too.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you so much for being with us this evening, for sharing your experiences. I think that there's an interesting question here, and maybe, Eric, I can throw it at you. Sorry to leave you unprepared, but it's around the idea of a carbon tax. Like, what are your thoughts on that? So there's a question coming in from someone online talking about the Canadian carbon tax. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, not too many. I can speak a little bit to what California's done. So we have a cap and trade program.
Yeah.
So there's sectors that basically have to contribute to the cap and trade program. They get carbon credits. They're allowed a certain amount, and the funds that come, or the fees that come from that program, are then reinvested into various climate change and clean energy programs in the state. It's been in operation about several years now, with some ups and downs. There's definitely been some lessons learned as we've implemented the cap and trade program in California.
Well, let's stay on policy now. And Elizabeth, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Thinking about the IRA, obviously, kind of possibly the most sort of like significant piece of climate legislation the United States has passed. How do you think that it will address the barriers that are going to prevent equitable access to energy for kind of like vulnerable communities?
Yeah. And just for the benefit of the audience, the IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed by the Biden administration. It's been about a year now, so we're beginning to see how that's playing out. One of the ways that particular, it's the most significant, not just in terms of volume and investment legislation, but also because it tries to approach equity at the forefront instead of as an afterthought. So there were some adders that were built into that particular policy to make sure that the most vulnerable, which is the underserved, underrepresented communities, are taken care of in terms of policy. So some of the things that it does specifically are, it gives extra bonus to projects that are built in areas that are defined as energy communities. So that could be low-income neighborhoods. It could be tribal lands, like Native American, within a Native American community. It could also be places that were previously maybe coal mining communities that are now going through transition. So those kind of projects get extra credit. There's motivation and incentive to build in those neighborhoods. There's other initiatives that have aligned with the IRA in this regard, like the Justice 40 is one of those initiatives that gives 40% of federal investment benefits back into those disadvantaged communities. There is the weatherization assistance program that helps low-income neighborhoods, for example, deal with issues pertaining to energy efficiency in their own homes. So I think those kind of policies that think about equity on the forefront, as opposed to as an afterthought, will be helpful just in terms of leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
And the IRA is a good example of that.
I'm interested actually in getting your thoughts of the group, and anyone can jump in on this. Really, it's about the balance between incentives and disincentives, because like the IRA, if I understand it correctly, is mainly carrot, right? It's not so much stick.
No.
How do you guys think we get that balance right between incentives and disincentives? And anyone, please feel free to jump in at this stage.
You want to take a shot?
Come on, no one's going
I'll take a shot. I'll take a shot. So I think one of the questions is this kind of question between carrot versus stick, and what's the right balance. I think general rule of thumb with technologies, we think about them starting off kind of in carrots, and as they mature, they move into kind of these more stick policy measures. It's a little more nuanced that. I think it depends really on what levers you can more easily pull, whether it's a carrot or a stick. Just an example, we're pursuing an electrification strategy in California. It's probably the most cost-effective approach to deep decarbonization. And so we're actually pursuing multiple pathways, one with carrots, especially with electric heat pumps for existing buildings where it's really hard to implement that through a stick measure. But for new construction, there's a pretty easy lever to pull there in requiring new construction to come with electric heat pumps or an all-electric building. So it's really how easily you can pull those various levers, I think, dictates whether it's a carrot or a stick.
Okay. Anyone got any thoughts on it? Andres?
Actually, I'm very much a friend of incentivation schemas that then make things move and make behavior change. On the other hand, when I look in closer surrounding, I simply have to say that looking into what's happening as a result of global warming. If we take, for instance, this vineyard example, and grapes just not delivering the required quality any longer as a function of too much of a heat and many things like this, I think we're running out of time. And us just waiting for incentives, so to say, doing the job and making a broad basis of society move towards the one or the other direction on its own, I think that simply doesn't work. And I give a very simple example where without a stick, probably things would have moved only very slowly, and that goes back to, in Europe, the deployment of the LED-based light bulbs. I myself got used to conventional bulbs over many years. It's just practical, and you know, the cost per light bulb is so low, and the light is also rather warmer and so on and so forth. But 95% of the energy a conventional bulb formerly was using was being dissipated in the form of heat. Only 5% of the electricity was resulting in the light element delivering lumen, and so to say lighting up the room circumstances. And there was many years debate in Europe, and then also kind of public advertisement in terms of, when you buy a more expensive so to say LED-based bulb, that pays off after 2 years or so. Yeah, nobody bought these light bulbs till the point came when there was legislation, and light bulbs, so to say conventional bulbs, started to get forbidden, and obviously that made people move into LED bulbs. And today, talking about Europe again, LED-based lighting is just a new normal. Nobody is even thinking about this being the new reality. These things are more expensive, but on the other hand, they have an incentive, they have a payback return of investment.
Sure.
But to get us there, took, so to say, the opposite approach of a carrot. So it's a balance.
All right, so Andreas, I'm going to stick with you if that's okay. We've been talking a lot about sort of like some of this kind of like high-level conversations around policy. And I'm interested to get your thoughts about technology specifically. And I mean, this is the first time in a long time I've been on a panel and we haven't been talking about artificial intelligence, may I add. So I'd love to get your thoughts on AI, data, and how we can use that better in order to kind of reach where we need to get to. Oh, and also, who's doing it well? Like, which organizations are doing it well that you see?
No, I'd tell you a practical example where, so to say, us being on the way to deploy more and more artificial intelligence has a big impact towards saving energy. And that is in the area of smartifying cities, and then also smartifying buildings. If you take buildings as an example, today the average office building and how that is being managed, it's pretty much, so to say, unintelligent air conditioning systems where you can put on the temperature, and independent on the point how many people are actually in the office building, where are they sitting and so on and so forth, the whole building is leveled or controlled towards one and the same cooling temperature. By deploying artificial intelligence combined with, for instance, occupancy tracking, so you can put very cheap sensors into each and every office room in an office building, all of a sudden AI can help you to, first of all, detect through these sensors where are people in what room, how many of the people are in the room, and through artificial intelligence also detect patterns. Patterns like, on Wednesday from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, typically there are 10 people in this room, and afterwards it is empty, and prior to that the meeting room is empty. Sure. And here artificial intelligence over time helps a lot to on-spot manage, so to say, climate and air conditioning that overall, when you look at the equation, saves up to 50% of electricity in a smart building. And that's the practical use of artificial intelligence.
All right, so let's move on from software to the hardware. Katie, you've worked in the oil and gas industry. I want to get your thoughts on, so we can deploy AI, we can obviously build policy, but there's some kind of like infrastructural challenges around. Like, how do you see that? How best to ensure that those challenges are addressed? Which are hard challenges, right? This is hard stuff.
No, it is. And I we talked a little bit earlier about taxation. I want to come back to that because I think one of the things that I see around infrastructure is in this country, particularly all states, this state included, our infrastructure has lived its shelf life. I mean, we have got to shore up our dams, our roads, our modes of transport. We've got to shore up even the pipelines, right, that are in this country. So when you look at, we're trying to address CO2, we're trying to address these big challenges, we've got to have the physical robustness, and we also, though, have to build harder. And what that means is we're not building for 50 years ago, we're building for 50 years from now, right? A good example is, there are dikes being built into the Gulf of Mexico to keep water from coming right on shore. And so how high do we need to build, right? So there's an adaptation piece to this, absolutely. But at the same time, we've got to be looking at current infrastructure and where we really just need to shore that up and invest in it. I think that's what's exciting, though, because the IRA is providing for that. And I do see a lot of activity coming from engineering procurement, firms that want to be a part of building that infrastructure and hardening that infrastructure.
Question, Eric and Elizabeth, maybe I can get both of you to comment on this. You're absolutely right, Katie, we have to make this transition in terms of the hardware, but obviously we have geopolitical tensions at the moment, we have real economic challenges at the moment, high inflation, in Europe there's a cost of living crisis. How do we ensure that this transition remains a priority? Because it's very easy to push it down the agenda when we're thinking about elections that are effectively like pocketbook elections. Eric, maybe you can have a comment on that first.
I think one of those is just making sure that we're not leaving any communities behind in the transition, that we're being thoughtful and we're being proactive about making sure that they're part of the transition. And also where we're going into new communities. One of the initiatives in California, it's a policy priority for the governors, is the Salton Sea is one of the biggest lithium resources in the world that we've found. It's also a community that is 20% poverty rate. It's been a community that for a while has been forgotten for a long time, and all of a sudden there's a lot of interest and a lot of developers trying to go into these communities, and they really need to build trust, and they need to build relationships, and they need to make sure that the communities realize the benefits of this transition, because a lot of times they don't.
Yeah, okay. Elizabeth, any thoughts on it?
I'm almost tempted to just say, like he said, but I would agree with everything that he said. But I would also say that we tend to talk about the energy transition like it's one transition with the exact same approach for everybody.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to also think about it in terms of how we tailor that to the communities. Yeah. They might need different things. That's what equity is about, right? Equity is not equality. It's not giving the community the same things. It's giving each community what it needs to address those challenges. So I think one of the other things that I would just add to what Eric said, which I agree with 100%, is also tailoring those solutions to the communities and making sure that we're centering those solutions to those communities and understanding that it's not one energy transition for everybody, that it's going to take a little bit of customization.
And I just want to throw one thing out there. You said the word priority. We need to make this a value. Values don't change, priorities change. So when we change the mindset that we value sustainability and we build that into our infrastructure and everything we do, we win.
Great point, thank you. So we're going to open it up to the audience now. Just wondered if we have got roving mics. Anyone got any thoughts, anything, any questions you'd like to add? Come on, I know you're a smart bunch. You've got lots of things to say. Gentleman there in the middle. We're just going to get a mic over to you, sir. Just over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know energy generation is a complex process, so it's not easy to quantify it. I have a question for Eric. Does the Energy Commission in California, has it commissioned any research where you have checked which energy generation system is really green, and have you rated it out, which one are better than others?
So I think the question was, do we know which electricity is coming in green?
My question is, have you looked at the different technologies needed for energy generation and have rated them out? Which energy is really green? Which energy generation method is green? Is solar better? Is wind energy better? Can you rate them out? Is nuclear better? has there been any unbiased study that you're aware of?
There's been a lot of analysis, a lot by some of the academic institutions that have taken a look at this. It gets a little bit complicated. Are we talking about the emissions from their operation? Are we talking about life cycle embedded emissions, thinking about the entire loop from their manufacturing? So it gets a little bit complicated. There's a lot of studies out there. Typically in California, we have what's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which utilities are required to procure a certain percentage of their generation from essentially renewable power plants, whether that's solar, wind, and there's a certification process there. It doesn't speak to this broader question about the full life cycle emissions, but there are a lot of studies, and I think as we're getting more sophisticated, some of those conversations are starting to come into play in various policy discussions. Buildings is another one. There's a lot of embedded emissions in these buildings, depending on what materials we use, and how do we start to think about that, and maybe from a policy standpoint, how do we start to incorporate that into various policies?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Any other questions? Gentleman just there, actually. Thank you.
Hi, this might be a little bit of a wild card since we were talking a lot about electrification through the energy sector, but knowing Infineon and with the context of Infineon working with many of with like consumer electronics, a question that I did have personally was, in the electronics industry, we're often marketed to upgrade to the next generation when things break. What do you think, in your perception, is one of the up-and-coming solutions or strategies that these large tech companies should be using to counter the effects of planned obsolescence?
Right. So I guess you're referring to replacement cycles and upgrading equipment generation over generation, and how to get that better under coverage. Now, look, so at the end of the day, it is each and everyone's personal decision then. Also within companies, you have corporate decision making, which is done by human beings, by executives, even by yourself, to at what point in time you start to upgrade for convenience reasons, upgrade for productivity reasons, but then also answering yourself the question, upgrade that goes then hand in hand with eventually then even something which is more productive and energy saving. And I believe there is many of such ways where, so to say, equipment is being available. Just think about on-premise servers as one example. Many companies, maybe not that popular in the Valley any longer, but when you look at it from a global perspective, are still using on-premise server equipment in the basement, and that runs at a certain price tag with regards to energy efficiency and energy dissipated in the form of heat instead of calculation power. There is cloud technologies in place which are far superior in some examples relative to, for instance, on-premise equipment, and you can make a choice. When you upgrade such an equipment for whatever reason, do you go into the cloud? And I'm not saying that cloud is always the better solution, but give or take, I believe cloud is a good case, and also with regards to decarbonizing Earth relative to, so to say, on-premise equipment, simply because cloud typically allows much more efficient calculation and providing calculation power at certain scale. So what I'm trying to say is, in between these vectors, companies can optimize productivity, upgrading, but then also, so to say, the underlying rationales in terms of operational cost and environmental aspects that need to be put into equation. And maybe the last sentence is ESG legislation plays a very important role. And many of us are corporate citizens. I see a lot of appreciation here in the room. So ESG legislation also paves the way, instead of the carrot only, giving, so to say, legal anchored guidance towards what to do to decarbonize also our companies. So.
Yeah, and we are beginning to see sort of some of that more kind of stick legislation with the right to repair, those conversations happening in many countries at the moment. Any other questions? Anyone? Just over there. Thank you, sir.
Hi there. Technology is great and innovation is wonderful. However, decentralized technologies are not as efficient. Just drawing a parallel to the healthcare sector, there are some initiatives where there are centralized data systems that are shared by different communities and agencies to help drive innovation in a centralized manner. So I would be interested in your thoughts on how we can centralize innovation in a way to help drive momentum and be more impactful as a global community in one location.
Oh, that is probably a very difficult one. I believe there are particular areas where centralized innovation makes a lot of sense. That is particularly the case in my experience when you think about innovating in a certain, so to say, technology sector. So talking about semiconductors, for instance, it makes a lot of sense to have innovation centralized when you develop the next generation wide bandgap technology. So there you have a lot of synergies when you have all people that work in the manufacturing equipment, that run the processes in manufacturing, plus people who run the R&D. When this all is on the same place, and there can be in situ optimizations on how to make, so to say, technology ready for the market, that makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, centralized innovation finds its edge, in my experience, when it comes to systemic innovation. And what I mean here is simply when different elements need to come together in the electronic sector, so software meeting microelectronics, meeting system hardware, meeting, so to say, then overall system integration. When you think about that in the wider sense, we need to foster on leveraging much better and getting more efficient to working together in innovation networks. And here, going forward, I believe companies will have a big benefit, do already have a big benefit, companies who manage better to, so to say, move in between that diversity of company and have, so to say, the best capability to get the best out of different teams in different locations, even in different sectors or companies. So that's an art which I believe going forward as an element to decarbonize planet Earth. That's an art which is an important part of the solution.
We've got time for one more question, I think. One more hand to pop up. Right there in the middle, please.
I'm going to ask you guys to do my job for me, and I'd love to hear from everybody on the panel. I am a VC in the climate space. We have a fund about $200 million to spend on climate technologies. Early stage, Series A and Series B, roughly speaking. I'd be curious to hear what are some of the sectors you think we should be investing in that return a 10x for my investors, or some sectors I should be staying away from because that is going to be, I'm setting money on fire. So curious to hear from the panel entirely here. Thank you.
Which sectors should our venture capitalist friend be investing in?
Oh, wow.
What do we think?
So,
not crypto, right?
Not crypto.
Katie, now is the time.
SaaS. No, I it's a really good question.
I think part of it's hard to nail down one specific sector.
It
I
is.
think
It is.
obviously storage is the big sector, but
Yeah.
within the sectors there's going to be winners and losers, and so I think it's just trying to identify those companies that are likely to be the winners. But energy storage is the big one that we're seeing.
I think manufacturing too. Some
Yeah.
manufacturing. You know, one of the places to check is I would go to the Greentown Labs website because there are 5 areas of focus where companies are in different stages. And I do think building materials are going to be huge too, right? There's a lot of innovation there. Don't think that you should talk to the workforce people. That's a long-term problem. So.
If you want to stay local, go to Cyclotron Road,
Yeah.
down the road in Berkeley. Yeah, we've.
So what, green steel, green concrete.
Yep.
Ship transportation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so just if you don't want to go to specific sectors, tell us about some companies you've seen recently that you're excited about, or pieces of research you're excited about.
So Fractal Labs is it's actually a BPOC-owned firm that's developing alternative PVC. I'm seeing, I can't think of the name of the company off at the top of my head. I actually just judged a student competition where the students are replacing polyethylene, in everything, using mycelium, so mushroom, okay, which is like abundant apparently across the earth, as new material in replace of styrofoam for industrial use. I mean, this is kids in high school coming up with this stuff, right? Kinetic energy, people walking across, building high trafficked areas. How can you store that energy and then like set it to the grid? There's a lot out there. There is, and it's kind of a bit of a spaghetti, like you were talking about, centralized innovation, and it's going to be messy for a while, I think, because it's still early. But that's just some of the stuff I'm seeing.
I would also say things like carbon capture, like there's a lot of CCS conversation, because removing existing emissions is going to become a big focus. So I think that's one area we're hearing a lot about. I don't know when direct capture becomes a reality, but that's one of the conversations. And then something really simple is software solutions. As this industry evolves and becomes more mature, the importance of data is becoming more valuable, and it's being used in so many different ways, whether it's measuring the performance of a wind farm or your solar plants or whatever, or even monitoring whether you have cracks in the blades. A lot of things are kind of becoming very software driven in this sector. So we've also seen a lot of software solutions come to bear, and a lot of companies created around that. Around tracking, I think somebody asked a question like, do you know it's green? Where is it coming from? So there's also a lot of focus as well on kind of, being able to manage around just a sector that's really now becoming mature.
Yeah. Just adding on the equation, talking about carbon capture, talking about storage systems and any kind of verticals is of course one way to answer the question. The other thing is always something that I'm asking myself, namely what is enabling all these applications? What is enabling software to run the most efficient way it has been stated? And at the end of the day, we come back to something which was to a large degree born in the Silicon Valley. Everything is enabled by semiconductors. So if you have a closer look into the semiconductor industry, the whole impact of semiconductors enabling carbon capture, enabling storage systems, enabling the smart grid, enabling renewable energy, enabling software to run more efficiently. Have a look into appropriate companies. Probably that's a good investment case going forward.
One last one I was going to say is intention. There is a company out there that is building a platform so that all of us can get pieces of investment in climate technologies, so we can raise capital that way. So there are a couple of those types of platform software companies that I know that are coming to the forefront.
I'm going to jump in and say there's a real opportunity in the chemicals industry. Every single object in this building is involved with has been manufactured using some kind of chemical that's used petrochemicals. There are companies out there that are trying to provide sort of solutions via biotech. One is a European company called GF Biochemicals they've patented all kinds of very interesting proteins that can be used to create chemicals that we're using at the moment. We're creating at the moment using petrochemicals. So I think there's a real opportunity there because most of the large FMCG companies, Unilever, those kinds of companies that have said they're going to stop using any kind of petrochemicals by 2030. So there's going to be a lot of innovation in the space. We have come to the end. I can't believe an hour has gone past, guys. This is absolutely flown by. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us online for this conversation. Thank you for your great questions. I'd like to thank all of you in this room for coming along and for being such an active group and such a thoughtful group. Steve, thank you so much for providing the wine and for your insights on what's happening at the winery. And thank you to our panel this evening. Thank you so much for your thoughts. It's been great and really exciting. And hopefully we can take forward some of your ideas and implement them and, maybe gather in the future to see, how the progress that's being made. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.